Let me say hello to everyone and thank you for joining, both to the Work Package 2 team and to our viewers. So my name is Griffith Kauser. I'm a policy officer at the European Polar Board, which is a membership-based organization representing the polar programs of 30 now different national research agencies, universities, and funding agencies across Europe. Uh, I want everyone to be very clear that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the SO-CHIC YouTube channel. We'll put a link in chat for that pretty soon. And just as a very brief introduction here, SO-CHIC is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, which is focused on measuring and understanding heat and carbon exchanges between the atmosphere and the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean being of pivotal climate importance, but its lack of representation in global climate models represents one of the main weaknesses of climate simulation and projection. So Work Package 2 and associated work packages are working to fill the data gaps and provide new models on that. SO-CHIC began in August 2018 and comprises 18 institutions, if I'm not mistaken. The European Polar Board is the lead on Work Package 8, which is policy communication and dissemination. So as part of our work package, we are conducting a series of webinars on all of the other work packages, as well as an introduction and a conclusion webinar. Today's work package, again, is Work Package 2. The others are all available online already, so this is the last work package webinar. We didn't go in order due to various scheduling constraints, but they're all going to be there shortly. We'll put a link to the project in chat as well. So Work Package 2 is led by the British Antarctic Survey and the University of Oxford. We have the Work Package co-leader, Dr. Alexander Brearley, with us to introduce the work package, talk about its goals and vision and how it connects to the broader SO-CHIC project. So with that, I will throw to Alex. Just a reminder, we'll take questions at the end of all of the combined presentations. We have 4 presentations in total, so you're free to ask the questions in chat, but they'll get answered after everyone has finished presenting. So again, Alex, over to you.
Well, thank you, Griffith, for that very kind introduction, and also thank you to the European Polar Board for giving us the opportunity to talk to everyone today. So I'm going to be talking about Work Package 2 within the Southern Ocean Carbon and Heat Impact on Climate Programme. I'm actually the first of 4 speakers today. We've got Natasha Lucas and Ryan Patmore, who are 2 of the postdocs in this project, and also my co-lead David Marshall at the University of Oxford, who are all going to be contributing talks to this programme today. So Work Package 2 is really focused around interactions between the upper ocean and the Southern Ocean interior. This is really critical for understanding, as you already said, Griffith, the links between the atmosphere and the ocean in heat and carbon uptake. And we've been using a whole series of different tools to try and better understand that problem. And as I say, there's got the 4 speakers today, but there's also been important contributions from David Ferreira, the University of Gothenburg as well, are also heavily involved in this work package. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've obviously been putting large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's caused a large trapping of heat within the Earth's system. And the ocean is critically important for taking up a whole bunch of that heat. So of the excess heat that's got trapped within the Earth system, since that time, about 90% has ended up in the ocean. So in the left-hand graphic here, you can see that the 2 dark panels actually just show the ocean's contribution to that. And you can see it's much larger than any other component of the Earth system. And within that, the Southern Ocean is disproportionately important. It accounts for something like 75% of that heat uptake, and also, interestingly, about 40 or 50% of the oceanic uptake of anthropogenic carbon. And that really comes about because it has a very unique pattern of ocean circulation that I'll talk briefly about now. The plot on the right-hand side here just gives you some evidence of that importance in the Southern Ocean. So you can see while global temperatures in the deep ocean have warmed, relatively slowly, in the Southern Ocean that's happened far more quickly since 1850. So it's critically important we understand this region, but it's really difficult because, first of all, the Southern Ocean is the world's biggest data desert. So it's very, very difficult to go and get measurements there. It's typically very stormy, beset by sea ice, and really quite hard to reach. This right-hand plot here just shows the coverage of a series of floats, Argo floats. These are a bunch of global profiling floats. And you can see from the red hashing here in the Southern Ocean that these are regions with the biggest dearth of data, the biggest sparsity of data in the global ocean. So it's really difficult to address some of these key climate problems. First of all, it's simply due to lack of data. And secondly, that lack of data makes it notoriously hard to get the Southern Ocean right in global climate models. So this right-hand graphic just shows some of the disparity between the observations and sea surface temperature within models. So this is a whole suite of different models. And you can see that many of the largest biases, this is sea surface temperature, actually occur in this Southern Ocean region. So there's lots and lots of work to be done here. And this is really important from a global perspective. The Southern Ocean sits really at the center of the global ocean circulation. So, waters come down from the north in the deep ocean, get upwelled in the Antarctic circumpolar current, this very large current that circulates around Antarctica, and brought back up to the surface where they're transformed into deep and intermediate water masses. So there's really, really lots of complex things happening in that region, which mean the lack of observations is particularly acute. Some of those things that can happen on many different scales. You've got really strong westerly winds that blow all the way around the continent. You've got sea ice formation processes in the wintertime and melt in the summer. You've got fresh water coming in from the Antarctic ice shelf and ice sheets. And you've also got, as I say, upwelling of these waters that are coming in from the north. And my colleague Natasha Lucas will be telling you a little bit more about that shortly. So lots of complex things are happening on a variety of different scales. And so it's really important that we get a better handle on those in order to make better climate projections for the future. And SO-CHIC is contributing to a whole number of different parts of that process. And Work Package 2, as I say, is primarily focused on those interactions between the surface ocean and the deep ocean. So it's obviously a huge problem. SO-CHIC obviously can't on its own solve all of it, however much we would like to. So what we've really done within SO-CHIC is to focus on one particular geographical region of the Southern Ocean. That's the Weddell Gyre. This is a region of the wind-driven currents to the south of the South Atlantic. It's important in a lot of different ways. It's important for the export of dense waters to the global ocean. It's important because it's a key region of upwelling of those waters that are coming in from the north. As I say, my colleague Natasha Lucas will talk a bit more about that. But it's also important because it illustrates many of the dynamics that are at play in the Southern Ocean and how those dynamics control that uptake and outgassing of both heat and carbon dioxide. So it's a really nice, I guess, case study. And the Work Package 2 is primarily focused in the northern part of the Weddell Sea in this box that you see on the screen here. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now. So it's of critical importance, and yet many of the models really poorly perform when we're thinking about CO2 fluxes into and out of the Weddell Gyre. So these plots on the left-hand side really just show the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere into the ocean in a bunch of different models in the black and data products in the blue. And you can see that both the decadal and to some degree the interannual variability is really poorly understood within these different models. That's partly because there's a whole new series of mechanisms that have come to light since 2010 for getting that carbon into the deep ocean. And I've just put a couple of examples here. I'm not going to talk in great detail about this, but we are at the cusp, I think, of a new understanding of a lot of these different processes. But it's also really important because we're at a phase of record low Antarctic sea ice extent, both in 2022 and 2023. And we know that sea ice is very much implicated in many of these processes. And so this big long-term decline in sea ice that's happened since 2016 is going to have an impact on this heat and carbon sequestration. So SO-CHIC Work Package 2 has had an ambitious coordinated autonomous vehicle campaign to document the evolution of the operation, including using both gliders and marrying that in with surface vehicles. That was talked about in the Work Package 1 webinar, and we won't talk a lot about that today, but it's really, I guess the point is just that it's very heavily coupled, this experiment. But we've also used high and super high resolution modeling to better inform the glider sampling, how we do it, and also to give us better understanding of processes as well. And so Natasha and Ryan will be talking about those two parts of SO-CHIC Work Package 2 today. And it's really that complementary approach that I think is really unique about this experiment. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Natasha, who's going to talk about winter observations using the autonomous platforms. We've then, as I say, got Ryan talking about modeling, and then my co-lead from the University of Oxford, David Marshall, will present some conclusions and some implications for understanding ventilation in the Southern Ocean more generally. So thank you, everyone, and across to you, Tasha.
Hi, everybody. Just give me a second to set up, please. Fantastic. Thanks for that introduction, Alex. Yes, my name's Natasha Lucas. I'm an observational physical oceanographer at British Antarctic Survey. And I'd like to talk to you today about the observational part of this study, where we collected year-round data, observing these upper ocean layers and analysing the pathway of how these layers are ventilated. And I'll explain all these terms. But before we look at our observations, let's set some groundwork. As Alex has touched on, the ocean is a series of layers that flow around the planet. Heat and gases are absorbed or emitted from the surface layer, and they either travel with this layer or they ventilate through to deeper water if sufficient energy is available. These layers are formed when more buoyant water sits above dense. In warmer regions, like on the left-hand panel here, and in the tropics, the layers are often separated by temperature, with warm water sitting over cold. Whereas in polar regions, cooler temperatures and the occurrence of ice and its meltwater means that the layers are often separated by salinity, with fresh water sitting over salty, as you can see in these panels. The surface layer, the surface mixed layer depicted here, this interacts with the atmosphere, and the depth of this layer is affected by weather and planetary horizontal flows. This is known as the surface mixed layer, in which properties are well mixed, constantly exchanging heat and gases with the atmosphere. It's often noted to have near constant temperature and salinity with depth. At the base of these layers, large gradients in temperatures and salinity occur, which are a strong energy barrier to mixing of these water masses vertically. Movement in the base of the surface layer, the mixed layer depth, depicted here, exchanges water properties, movement in the base of this surface layer, the mixed layer depth, can entrain this water from above or below, and this can exchange water properties, which is known as ventilating. This brings water properties from the surface mixed layer down into the deeper ocean. This is important from a climate perspective, bringing properties that are constantly exchanged with the atmosphere to the deep ocean, where it can be locked away for decades to millennia. In a real-world schematic, those layers look a little like this. This is a cross-section of the ocean. We have here Antarctica on the left-hand side, South America shown, with the warm waters in the northern extents. The north-south flow at the southerly point of the Atlantic is depicted here, with pathways of these water masses shown. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which runs along here, the world's largest ocean current, is a region of the planet that is very, very stormy, with strong westerly winds, meaning surface water is mixed readily and properties are exchanged freely with the atmosphere. And you notice it well if you're at sea. So these winds blow on a spinning Earth, and this spinning Earth causes a rotation of the flow vector. And what that results in is it results in this northward transport in the southern hemisphere. This is known as Ekman transport, after the man who discovered it in 1905. This northward transport takes these vertical layers and it tilts them. And what that tilting does is that brings deeper water up to the surface in this region. This deeper water is a layer of water that has traveled around the planet over millennia, and it's now upwelled to the surface. It allows transfer between the atmosphere and deeper waters. And this is the region of our SO-CHIC Work Package 2 study area. Is that going to work? Yeah. Yes. So to come back to the energy that allows this surface layer to change in depth, we look at storms and ocean fronts. This video here depicts ocean fronts, which are meandering features on a horizontal scales. We're zooming in here on a feature known as the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic. And these features are known as mesoscales. The ocean is a soup of eddies where these mesoscales spin off. Fine scale features on this are called sub-mesoscales, which are about 1 to 10 kilometers in size. And they lie within the surface mixed layer, which Ryan will talk about in his talk in a moment. Due to the horizontal extent, they're very hard to measure, but autonomous ocean gliders are now able to fill that data gap. So we're making step change in data analysis. One example of a sub-mesoscale instability or a sub-mesoscale breakdown is on the left-hand side here. When the wind blows along these sub-mesoscale features or fronts, Ekman transport means that different water properties can be pushed horizontally, causing a stable or unstable water column. For example, in this illustration here, you can see cold water would be pushed over warm. This would be unstable and would cause mixing. But if it was warm over hot, that would be stable, and we could have salty over fresh, and so on and so forth. On the right-hand side here, you can see a soup of processes that are come about due to the weather and storms on our planet. These affect the properties on the surface of the surface mixed layer, and this changes the fluxes in and out of this layer. There is a seasonal variation in the radiation received. The sun heats in the summer and generally goes from the atmosphere into the ocean and vice versa in winter. And this acts to either shoal or deepen that surface mixed layer. Here we can see the yearly surface heat flux, with red being a running mean of 12 hours at our SO-CHIC study site, where you can see here we've got the summer positive heat flux into the ocean, and here we have a negative heat flux, and this provides a stability and a destabilizing mechanism in the ocean. So let's move on to our glider measurements and our autonomous instrument measurements, sorry. I here show you images of the instruments that we used. This was one of the most ambitious autonomous vehicle deployments to date, with 12 months of data, unprecedented right through the winter period, not possible on a ship. We collected from an array of different underwater and surface vehicles. The vehicles here are shown. Underwater gliders are super cool in my humble opinion. They are state-of-the-art, low-powered instruments running on batteries. They're low-carbon, remotely piloted, underwater for long deployments. They are driven by buoyancy, moving from the surface to depths of 1,000 meters and back to the surface again. We flew them in a 15-kilometer bow tie pattern to be able to elucidate this sub-mesoscale information, and Ryan will talk more about this. These were accompanied with surface vehicles, and these surface vehicles monitored the weather and surface ocean currents and storms. So here we have some of our results at our main study site. This is from the autumn through to spring in the austral, so in the southern hemisphere. So it's flipped to what you might be used to in the northern. At the top panel here, we have temperature against depth down to 500 meters. Below that, we have the salinity. And below that, this is the stability, the potential energy barrier I was talking about, known as the buoyancy frequency. The black line that you can see here is known as the mixed layer depth, which we've also talked about. And this is calculated from a density difference from the near surface measurements. You can see that this stability peaks in the autumn. And it peaks just below this mixed layer depth, which is illustrating how hard that water is to mix vertically. As winter and then spring progresses, this stability breaks down somewhat, allowing these waters or reducing this potential energy barrier. You can also see, as we go from autumn to winter and then into spring, the surface layer cools and it freshens and gets less salty. So let's focus on temperature and mixed layer depth. So here again, we have the same panel, slightly larger with depth on the left-hand side. And you can see we're going through from autumn, winter, and into spring. You can see this cold layer below the mixed layer depth. This is actually a remnant of the winter spring water that's been left behind when it's capped by warm water in the summer. As we move from autumn into winter, you can see that this mixed layer depth deepens, and there's a lot of high frequency variability. The surface layers are mixed with the layers below during this very energetic time, when the weather and ice changes the surface properties. Here, we show the wind input to the surface layer from reanalysis products. What a reanalysis product is, it's a best estimate from global models and observations, much like a weather forecast. The blue line that you can see on this graph here is the point where the ice was closest to the gliders, approximately 55 kilometers away. It then subsequently retreated. The top panel we've got here shows the wind forcing, with red showing peaks and black showing troughs. The next panel down shows the wind speed in blue and the wind direction in orange. The panel below that is our mixed layer depth, and you can see there's lines through these panels that show the high and low storm periods. And below that, we've got the heat flux from the reanalysis product, which is into and out of the surface depending on the season. We've highlighted a few features here. These features in orange are high wind forcing events. These high wind forcing events often cause this mixed layer to deepen. What's also interesting is these gray periods here, these are interstorm or quiescent periods between storms. And in these periods, the mixed layers shoal. You can see here, we're getting a shoaling of this mixed layer. Other scientists have noticed this too. Carranza noticed phytoplankton blooms due to these gradients in the mixed layers during these interstorm periods. And Duplessis noted a reduction in turbulence and an increased warming despite consistent mean heat flux into the surface. And this was due to these changes in mixed layer depth. We're going to be looking at this and into the wind front alignments to elucidate the drivers of surface depth changes. Because you can see here in these quiescent periods in our results, we have a mixed layer shoaling and it appears to coincide with a wind direction change. That could be due to the storm front alignment from submesoscales we were talking about, or other factors, and it's a lot to unpick and very interesting science. So, in conclusion, recent studies in the region show important links between these properties of stress, periodicity in the wind stresses, the covering of the sea ice, how that breaks up, different surface fluxes and submesoscale, so horizontal variability, and controlling this mixed layer depth, which controls the heat fluxes, the temperatures in the surface, which affects how much is exchange between the surface and the atmosphere. That's then pulled down into the deeper oceans through the ventilation pathways. They're all linked systems, and it's trying to unpick these different processes that's really interesting, at least for me. The summer stratification has been shown to be delayed by these submesoscale instabilities. And submesoscale activity has been seen with buoyancy gradients underneath sea ice. The calm periods between the storm allow biooptical gradients to develop, and this could also be linked to a reduction in turbulence. SO-CHIC's exciting new wintertime measurements showing a variable response of this to different storm events and quiescent periods. And this is in response to different surface heat fluxes and the individual components within that, like sensible and latent heat, radiation, and so on. There's also wind stress and how that is affecting the surface, if it's strong or calm, and if that's aligned with different front directions, causing these sub-mesoscale alignment changes in mixed layer depth. And also there's another super sub-mesoscale activity that's linked in with these horizontal sub-mesoscale flows. So I'm a little bit early, I'm sorry, but I'm going to leave you with a media campaign that we did with the European Polar Board called Tasha Goes South on Instagram. And here we have some of the photos and videos from the cruise where we deployed and recovered the gliders for this, for part of the data that you see here. So here we're recovering a glider that's been out for 9 months, unprecedented. And on the right-hand side, if I just rewind it, you can see us deploying here a glider with a turbulence probe on top in very high seas. Some amazing moments right up next to the ice bed, south of the wall, and some more fun. So I thank you very much for listening. And I'm now going to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to talk about the modelling aspects of the work that we've done. Thank you.
Okay, great. That's a great lead into the stuff that I'm going to talk about. As Tasha said, I'm going to talk from a more modelling perspective. First of all, I'll introduce myself though. So my name is Ryan Patmore. I was working on the SO-CHIC project for 2 years. I'm no longer working on it. I was at the University of Reading on the SO-CHIC project, but I took up a permanent position at the NOC last year. But I thought I'd come and present some of the stuff that I was doing on the SO-CHIC project. The talk that I'm going to give has 2 threads. So first of all, the observations are obviously a very critical aspect of this investigation, but it's useful to know, give some guidance to best practice on sampling strategies. So first of all, I'm going to give a component on how the glider sampling strategies are representative. I'm going to use the model data for that, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But then I'll also talk a bit more about the dynamics for the second part, looking at the differences in the margin ice zone versus not the margin versus the open ocean, and give some perspective of energy budgets on there. So next slide. First of all, I'd like to introduce the model. So this is just a snapshot of the model that Tasha had already briefly shown in her presentation. So this first one is just to give an idea of what the model output looks like. So capturing lots of the eddying features in the surface. The model is over quite a small region, so it's 4 by 4 degrees in latitude and longitude. You can see the temperature on the sides there, and then the top is zeta over F, which is just there to give a sense of the resolution of the eddying features in the fronts that are happening in this region. So next slide, please. This is just a bit more detailed overview of the configuration. So as has been introduced, we've got this study site in the northern part of the Weddell Sea on the right-hand side here. So this is just a map of the Weddell Sea, and then in the purple type color is the study site, and that is also the boundary of the model simulation that I'm going to present on. The model uses NEMO, that's at version 4. We include sea ice. The resolution is 1/48 of a degree, and that's approximately 1 kilometer. The temporal coverage, this is constrained by the forcing that we had, is from 2012 to 2013, and that ran from December to March for the analysis that I'm going to show. Lateral forcing was from a global simulation at lower resolution, and then we have ERA interim at the surface. So yeah, that's the overview of the model. Next slide. Now just some more sort of insight into the outputs that we have. So this is just surface snapshots from the model. In the center here, you'll see this is the sea ice fraction. So it's just giving a sense of the sea ice and the imprint that has on the other quantities of the model. So moving to the left, you then have temperature, and you can see that the cold surface temperatures associated with the presence of the sea ice. This is during, I'll give more details on this, but this is during a period of melt. So there's a freshwater input there, and where there isn't sea ice, the surface temperatures are a lot warmer. And then moving to the right, this is zeta over F, so that's relative vorticity divided by the planetary vorticity. And this is just to give an idea of the kind of character of the eddying and fronts that you get in sea ice versus non-sea ice zones. So you can see it's very different. There's much larger features outside of the ice zones. And yeah, this is not really a results dynamics slide. It's just an insight into the model. I'll talk more about this kind of stuff towards the end of the talk. But first of all, I'll go into the glider sampling strategy aspect. So next slide, please. So as Tasha said, the glider uses this bow tie pattern. So on the left-hand side here is an example of what that looks like. The glider, this is from above. So the glider goes along this path in kind of a figure of 8 or a bow tie kind of shape, and it continues doing repeat sections as you go around. I'm pointing at the screen. So what we wanted to do was to assess how well the glider sampling pattern, in particular this bow tie pattern, represents the model data. So what that does is shows us how well this pattern recovers the data that it's trying to sample. So we do virtual deployments of the glider in many places and repeat that many times. And then, so we sample the model using the bow tie pattern as if it was the glider, and then we compile a set of data sets that compile a data set that allows us to get a statistical view of this approach. And I will give one example of the sampling strategies that we investigate, but this is a paper. This is all in a paper that's been submitted and is under review right now. So there are many other aspects of the sampling that we assess, but I'm just going to give one example today. So if we move to the next slide. So an important aspect of glider measurements is measuring a glider sampling is to measure lateral buoyancy gradients. So we're using this approach to assess the ability of the gliders to recover the model the model buoyancy gradients. So in this plot here, I'm just going to describe what's going on here. So on the y-axis is the distribution of the buoyancy gradients, and then on the x-axis is the probability density function. So this is here to give a sense of how the distribution is recovered by the gliders. So I'm showing the upper decile and the lower decile here, and the smaller the distance between the upper decile and the lower decile, the less uncertainty there is on the recovery of the results. So this is a probability density function across all of the 100 deployments that I do in the model, and so I'm recovering the kind of statistical distribution of the buoyancy gradients recovered by all of the glider deployments. And you can do this for various deployments or various time intervals. So what I mean by that is you can have a different number of gliders. You can test how, like, the sensitivity to a different number of gliders, or the sensitivity of to a different length of sampling. And that is what I'm going to first introduce on the next slide. So if we go to the next slide. So on the right-hand side here is what I showed previously, but on the left-hand side is doing the same thing, but testing for different timescales of deployment and different number of gliders deployed at any one time. And so the different colors are associated with a different number of gliders. I'm testing 1 glider deployment, 4 simultaneous glider deployments, or 20 simultaneous glider deployments. And then also testing different deployment lengths for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then the full simulation time, which is approximately 3.5 months. We won't think about the orange line for the moment. I'll come back to that. But if we start with the left-hand side for the 1 week deployment, you can see that the distribution of the buoyancy gradients recovered by the gliders, for the certainty on that, it reduces with the number of gliders you deploy. And we see the same thing as you go across in terms of changing the length of the deployment. So the longer you deploy for, the less uncertainty there is on the recovery of the buoyancy gradients. And that makes sense. The more data you have, the more certainty you have. But what's interesting about this is that you are converging on a result, but it's slightly different to what the model gives you. So the orange line here is the model mean distribution of buoyancy gradients. And you can see that it's the glider is overestimating the small buoyancy gradients, but underestimating the large buoyancy gradients. So there's a slight mismatch there. So the more data you recover, the more certainty you have in the results, but there's a slight offset in what that recovers. And the thinking here is that the glider is not always crossing fronts perpendicularly. So as you can see here, there's the glider is making its path along the bow tie, but the fronts are not necessarily orientated perpendicular to the direction of travel of the glider, so it's not picking up the full buoyancy gradients. So an interpretation of the results below is saying that there's a slight underestimation of the size of the buoyancy gradients that are recovered. And we can actually test this idea by doing the whole set of sampling again, but instead of using, but when you're crossing fronts, you find what happens if you're always sampling perpendicular to these gradients. And so if we go to the next slide, so that's what I've done here. So instead of, so I've done repeated the same methods, except ensuring the glider always crosses the fronts perpendicular. So you can see now on the 4 panels for the different times and the different number of gliders. So you get the same picture in terms of the more gliders you have or the longer you deploy for, the more certainty there is on the data, but also the results actually converge onto the model mean. So that indicates that the kind of small mismatch in the previous plot was associated with the fact that the glider isn't always traveling perpendicular to the fronts. And so in the paper under review right now, we go into this further and do more of a quantification of what deploying more resources does for you in terms of recovering buoyancy gradients, but I won't go into that. Just keep an eye out. And there are other aspects of the sampling strategies that we investigate. So, but I will finish this aspect there and move on. So next slide, please. Okay, so to start with, I kind of pointed at the fact that there are differences in the model in terms of the coverage of sea ice, and was interested in the impact on the sea ice on the surface ocean. So on the left-hand side here, you have this is again the sea ice concentration, and you can see for this period of time, this is just a snapshot. I think it's December, some point in December. There's sea ice in the southern half of the domain. So what I've done here is I've partitioned the domain into the whole domain, the northern part and the southern part, and I've produced a time series of means for the surface of the model. So in the middle panel here, you have sea ice area. So that's just the coverage of the sea ice. So the green is the southern end, the yellow is the full domain, and the purple is the north. And you can see that, as I've said, the northern part of the domain has much less sea ice than the south. And then if you go down, you can see as you go across in this domain, as we transition into summer and autumn, the sea ice disappears, and that's associated with a flux of fresh water during that period. The top panel here shows the lateral buoyancy gradients associated with this time period for the different portions of the domain, and you can see it starts off with the area where the sea ice is, the buoyancy gradients are much larger than for the northern part of the domain where there is no sea ice. But the three lines slowly tend towards each other as the sea ice disappears over time, and eventually when there's no sea ice and it's been a long time since there was sea ice, they all are roughly following the same trajectory in terms of the size of the buoyancy gradients. So that's just setting the scene of how this model evolves through to March. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is an overview of what we see in the surface over this period. So first of all, again, as I said before, on the right-hand side, you have the sea ice concentration. And in the center, you can really see that imprint of the larger buoyancy gradients where the sea ice is, and in the northern part of the domain where there's no sea ice, the buoyancy gradients are much smaller. And then on the left-hand side, you have the mixed layer depth. There's also an imprint of the sea ice on that, so the mixed layer depth is much shallower where the sea ice is. So we're generally seeing a picture of differences between where the sea ice is and not, in dynamical features such as buoyancy gradients, which disappear over time. So if we go to the next slide, this is as I said, for a later time period when the sea ice is all gone, following retreat, the buoyancy gradients, the strength of them are much more homogeneous across the domain, and the signature and the mixed layer depth is still there a little bit, but there's much more similarity between the north and the south of the domain. So this is essentially where the work left off when I finished the post, but the trajectory was going into looking at how the dynamics associated with these differences, and really understanding what leads to the differences in the strength of the buoyancy gradients. And so started looking into diagnosing the energy budgets. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll just give a hint of where that went. So this is a kind of future view, unfinished work kind of view of the project. So yeah, so this is the energy budgets integrated over the full mixed layer depth. And so in the bottom right-hand side, you'll see the tendency. So that's the general change in energy over time. The next one to the left is the vertical buoyancy fluxes. The next one to the left is the influence of wind and vertical diffusion on the buoyancy, on the energy, and on the energy change. And then on the top middle and right, you have the vertical and lateral advection of energy. So that's the stirring, and then the pressure gradient on the top left. And all of these terms add up to the tendency term. So you can see there's mainly a balance between the wind and diffusion, and you can see a slight imprint. So this is the same as before, where there's sea ice in the south and not in the north. So you can see a slight imprint of the sea ice on this energy budget, where there's less of a tendency and smaller values in all of the other fields. But yeah, this is a bit of ongoing investigation, and I will finish it there. So we'll go to the summary slide. Okay, so just to summarize, I've introduced this high resolution model patch, which was capturing a lot of the dynamics in terms of the eddying and the fine scale fronts. And we'd used this model for two avenues of investigation. The first is to look into glider sampling strategies. In particular, I presented on investigating the resources used during a glider campaign in terms of length of sampling and length of deployment and number of gliders deployed at any one time. And we identified in those results the difference you get when you are able to sample at all times across fronts. And we see a difference between those two. And then presented a little bit on the differences you find in the marginal sea ice zone in the dynamics between, or the metrics you get from in the sea ice zone versus the open ocean, with much stronger buoyancy gradients seen under sea ice. And the idea is that's associated with lower levels of mixing under the ice, but lots of future work to do there. And we have someone joining us, I think, in the future to maybe pick up some of that. But from here, I'll leave that to David to finish us off.
So thank you, Ryan. So my name is David Marshall. I work in the physics department at the University of Oxford. And I'm the co-lead along with Alex of Work Package 2. And I also was co-supervising Ryan along with David Ferreira when he was at Reading, and will be co-supervising the person who will be taking on the remainder of the modelling analysis from March this year until the end of the project, the end of October. So I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes or so just wrapping up this presentation. And just giving you a couple of, well, some implications, I guess, for the bigger picture, and give you a taster of some of the other work that we've been involved with addressing this topic. So next slide, please. So let me start by just concluding wrapping up the work you've heard about from Tasha and from Ryan. They've given you a really excellent summary of what we've been doing with the observations and with the modelling. The first thing I want to say is it's been a very exciting work package to be involved with for me, because there really has been a genuine integration between the modelling and the observations. So Ryan's told you about the very high resolution model we've set up of this little postage stamp of the Southern Ocean, and used it to look at glider sampling strategies. And in fact, we've just resubmitted a revised manuscript on this paper, and it's been fantastic to have the inputs from both the modelling and the observational side there. And I think this is a real example of how these programs can work to bring those communities together. I won't go over the results again. Ryan has so beautifully just summarised those. And then, of course, on the observational side, what we've delivered is this coordinated autonomous vehicle campaign. We've documented the full year evolution of the upper ocean with both underwater gliders and surface vehicles, and of course informed by the modelling strategy. So specifically, Tash has told us about how 4 gliders have been deployed, and we've produced the time series of temperature, salinity and pressure over the upper kilometre of the ocean. And I think perhaps the headline result for me, which perhaps isn't surprising, but it doesn't mean it's any less important, is that there's a huge amount of variability in mixed layer depth associated with these atmospheric weather system storms. And those, it's hard to understate really how important those are for air sea fluxes of heat and carbon. Next slide. So on the modeling side, so Ryan has just told us about then the high resolution modeling actually focus now on the physics of the annual cycle in this region of the Southern Ocean. And I think really the headline result has been the importance of the sea ice. Ryan again just spoke about this, so I don't need to repeat what he said, but except just to emphasize, sea ice is really order one in controlling the sub-mesoscale physics, and in particular this zone at the boundary between the sea ice and the open ocean. So this has a dramatic impact on the mixed layer and therefore on the ventilation. So this work is very much ongoing. The model and calculations are basically completed, but the analysis is going to be done by the new postdoc that we've hired, who will be starting in March of this year. One of the challenges you always face in these programs when you hire good people like Ryan is they tend to be too successful. So of course it's wonderful that he's got a permanent job, but it's also fantastic we've managed to get someone in to complete this important work. I also should have said on the previous slide, there's still quite a bit of work to do with the observations too. So in addition, of course, to the challenges of taking observations in such a harsh environment as the Southern Ocean, we've had to, or I should say the observational team has had to deal with the rather unique challenges that have been imposed on us by COVID, which of course has set things back rather substantially. And we've had to be pretty agile actually in responding to those. And they've done a fantastic job in delivering the observations, I think, despite those challenges. So forward 2 slides now, Tasha. SO-CHIC isn't the only work that we're involved with, looking at the sort of topics that can help us address upper ocean ventilation pathways in the Southern Ocean. I thought I would pick out just a couple of examples of additional work. So one that's ongoing and one that we completed in parallel with SO-CHIC. So the first is the Biopole program. This is an ongoing NERC funded, so UK Natural Environment Research Council funded program involving various of the UK marine science centres. So Biopole stands for Biogeochemical Processes and Ecosystem Function in Changing Polar Systems and Their Global Impacts. And well, the basic idea is that in the current season, we're deploying cyclone gliders, which are occupying 10 to 20 kilometre transects, so relatively short transects, but crucially, which are going underneath the retreating sea ice in the Northwest Weddell Sea. And the idea is we want to better understand the seasonal evolution in the mixed layer as the sea ice retreats during December to February. We'll see in a moment that that's a rather critical period for ventilation of the ocean, and the implications then for nutrient delivery to the surface mixed layer, to the euphotic zone, where the biogeochemical activity is taking place. This is the first time that autonomous vehicles have been deployed in this manner on the sea ice in the Southern Ocean, I understand. So it's quite an exciting project, and you can really see how it builds on SO-CHIC and adds very much to the work that we've been undertaking in SO-CHIC. And then the next slide, well, I've got 2 slides actually. So the first is just to emphasize that Work Package 2 is part of the wider SO-CHIC program, of course. So it's very much tied in then with the deep ocean ventilation pathways, the air sea fluxes. We've been looking at the polynyas. And on the next slide is a piece of work that really cuts across many of these different work packages, including Work Package 2. So this is work by Andrew Stiles, who I see is in the webinar today, which is rather nice. So Andrew has just completed his PhD with me at the University of Oxford, also with Mike Bell at the Met Office. And one of the studies he completed for his PhD was looking at ventilation of the Southern Ocean in a NEMO model, a free-running NEMO model at quarter-degree resolution. So all the usual caveats of a model, it's model world, it's quarter-degree resolution, many processes that are important, as we've just heard, are not well resolved. And this is a paper that's currently under review. And what Andrew does is to deploy Lagrangian trajectories, backward in time trajectories, and model trajectories, unlike real gliders and floats, are cheap. So Andrew deployed 480 million of these trajectories backward in time, and he's basically mapped out how ventilation occurs across the Southern Ocean. And if we look at the left, first of all, what we're seeing here is a map of the median month in which ventilation of the deep ocean occurs, and then the histogram of the month of ventilation. And you can see that it's late winter when ventilation occurs. And this is just the same as in the Northern Hemisphere. So there, ventilation tends to occur in March, April. In the Southern Ocean, it's October, September, October, November time again. And that's true across the whole Southern Ocean. And then on the lower right, we can see the positions at which ventilation is occurring, the density, the median density of the water that's then ventilated from each region, and the mean age over this 30-year model integration of the water that's ventilated. And I'll perhaps just point out, first of all, actually, I think a surprising result to us is actually how over much of the Weddell Gyre there isn't any ventilation occurring in this model. Which is kind of interesting. But if you look more carefully, there's an awful lot of ventilation on the shelf, and also on the flanks of the gyre. And we're still, I think there's still open questions then about the role of sea ice and the sort of processes Ryan talked about in driving that. And you can see that this is rather dense water here, which fills much of the ocean that's being ventilated from this region. Okay, so moving to my final slide. I really just want to wrap up by saying SO-CHIC has provided and is still providing many insights into the Southern Ocean heat and carbon uptake and the impacts on climate. But it's important to stress this is a really challenging problem. We're dealing with a highly turbulent fluid in a very remote and inhospitable region. And so many challenges remain. So there's an awful lot of work to be done. And I'm sure a lot of exciting work to be done in future EU-funded programs. Thank you.
All right. I don't know if any of our speakers have any final thoughts attached to the presentations. Otherwise, I'll thank everyone. And I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions. I think the Q&A feature is available, but you can also just type them in chat, where you can also find the links to the SO-CHIC YouTube channel and the SO-CHIC project page. And while the audience is formulating their questions, I want to sneak in and I'm gonna do my job as a policy officer. So excuse me if I don't get too technical here, but I just wanted to ask, I guess the work package leads, but feel free to chime in, any of you. So if you're a European, or really a lot of people who are quite far removed from the Antarctic geographically and also informationally, to be fair, you guys are generating a huge amount of data. You're sort of pioneering the way autonomous vehicles are collecting data. You're doing all of these models, and you take it all back to the European Union or national governments or anyone else. And what do you think this data should say to them in terms of their future decision making? Where do you think this data fits into the decision making process? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off with an answer to that, and then I'll let Alex join with any further comments. I mean, the short answer is, I mean, we're talking an awful lot about the climate crisis, of course. Climate change is an issue that is going to affect and is affecting everyone on the planet at the moment. And as Alex said in the introduction to his talk, the Southern Ocean is disproportionately important as part of this climate system. And the Weddell Gyre that we've talked about is disproportionately important within the Southern Ocean, because this is where a region where of deep water formation. So it's where the densest waters in the ocean are formed. And so it's crucially important then in terms of uptake of heat from the atmosphere and also the uptake of carbon. And these are quantities we really need to get right in order to understand how much the ocean is warming at present, how much the climate system is warming, and how it's likely to continue warming or indeed warm at an increased rate if we don't do anything about it in the future. So although it may seem that the Southern Ocean is rather remote, you know, as I showed in the final picture, and Alex had the same picture, you know, we're dealing with a global plumbing system, if you like, and this is one of the crucial regions. You know, it's a bit like where your boiler is located, I guess. It's the wrong analogy, but you know what I mean. It's a crucial part of the plumbing system of the global planet. And however remote it is, it's in everyone's interest, whatever country you're living in, to collect the data in this region and understand what's going on. And then, of course, I should also add that there's been a lot in the media over the last year about the record low ice coverage in this region. And I'm not an expert on this. Alex knows a lot more about this, but you know, it really is, I think, quite alarming, given the conversation we've just had. That on top of that, there's observations indicating that we may be heading into uncharted territory in terms of ice coverage.
Yeah, I mean, just one sec.
On mine. Okay, now you can speak.
Yeah. So no, I mean, just to echo really what David has said, I think, you know, the Southern Ocean, the role of these different forcing changes, whether it be big changes in sea ice, changes in Southern Ocean winds, etc., what impact they will have on the future in terms of how efficient that heat and carbon pump is into the ocean, not just on the physical side, but also on the biological side. I mean, you know, this work package has been quite heavily physically focused, but you know, we sort of glossed over, and apologies to any biologists who are here, we glossed over a lot of the biological details about the carbon pump, but how those kind of impacts will affect what's going to happen in the future to the efficiencies of those pumps is going to be really critical. I mean, in terms of scenarios, in terms of whether we're thinking about, you know, this could be significantly affecting the actual concentration of CO2 that we end up with in the atmosphere by 2100. So I think that's why we should care, because it's going to, you know, potentially lead to different amounts of warming, and that will have impacts for food security. It'll have impacts for sea level rise. It'll have impacts for all of those different things that, you know, European Union and other policymakers, you know, national policymakers are so interested in. So picking apart a lot of these processes is really critical. I mean, in terms of what we're doing as part of SO-CHIC, I think, you know, helping to feed in a lot of these results, making better, you know, representations of a lot of these processes within models, is going to be really key if we're going to make that leap between, you know, blue sky science and policy. And you know, we are, I think, as a team, quite heavily minded on that. And we're aware, we're not naive. We don't think that isn't an easy step to take, but it is really crucial when you're thinking about policy. So, good question, Griffith. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. It's quite comprehensive. So, again, I'll ask the audience if they have any questions to go ahead and put them in the chat. But I've got another one lined up, just sort of following off of your previous answer. So your mission here, and the mission of the SO-CHIC project in general, is to fill the data gaps in the Southern Ocean by and large. So which data gaps have you found most difficult to fill, or where is the data most difficult to come up with? Because you've been doing a lot with autonomous vehicles and everything, but do you find that you're still lacking the tools for some of the data you'd like to get? And do you have enough, you think, to fulfill your objectives as it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll make a. Ooh, I think we're both unmuted. Sorry.
How's that? No, you've got to do it.
Okay, that's fine. Apologies. The problems of Zoom in the same room. Sorry. So, I mean, in terms of the tools, I think, ocean observing generally has had a revolution in the past 30 years, particularly since, Argo went in the water in the early 2000s. Just the volume of data that we collect in the ocean now is vastly improved compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. And so we're able to understand variability far better than we could even over that short time frame. However, we are still very constrained. And, one particular place that we are still incredibly constrained is under sea ice and also under ice shelves as well, where we know that, a lot of the most important processes are actually happening. So, in terms of, and that's partly a difficult to get there problem, but it's also partly a technological limitation on the instrumentation as well. So David quite nicely alluded at the end to the fact that we're starting to put gliders under sea ice. It is now getting to the stage where it's possible, but it's still limited. Okay, and we need, if we're going to do this in a long-term strategic way, we need things like acoustic networks that can talk to gliders underwater to carefully position them when they're under the ice. We need these big kind of programs in place in order to let us do those kind of big scale things. We use a lot of data opportunistically. We have things like instrumented seals, which we use, and they've been very good actually at allowing us to get measurements under the ice the first time. The biologists love them because they get lots of information about the seal behavior. We love them because we get temperature and salinity data in really difficult to reach places. But there are still a lot of challenges in the instrumentation sphere. There's a second challenge as well, and David may have more to add on this, or Ryan or other people. And that's, as the volume of data ramps up, it's how to actually ingest that kind of volume of data. How we actually, traditionally, the traditional model of observation is that you go away, you get on a ship, you take a discrete amount of data, and that's kind of it. You process it on board, that's kind of it. Now we're having huge amounts of data sent back to us in real time through these kind of float programs, through gliders. So that the amount of data, going up, and just doing the quality control on that data and the amount of time that time and resource that takes. So better smart algorithms for dealing with some of these quality control issues, better data assimilation schemes for getting this put into models. All of those I think are going to be key to making the most of that data revolution as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Others may have things to add, but I'll leave it at that point.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of points. So first of all, stepping beyond work package 2, which is focused on the upper kilometre and thinking about the broader SO-CHIC and Southern Ocean. I would say that the other problem is we've got very little data below 2 kilometres. And so what's called deep Argo, I think is very exciting, but it's obviously more expensive dealing with the very high pressures and remoteness again of the deep ocean. So, but I think that's an important area moving forward. The deep ocean is very data sparse, and also biogeochemical sensors should add. I'm going to also add one other point, which I feel I'd be remiss not to, because it's not trendy actually, but it's very important, which is, so part of this we can do nothing about. There is very little data going backwards in time. Obviously, unless we invent time travel, we can't do anything about that. But, people love to talk about how change since the 1960s. It's kind of scary when you look at the number of data points that were collected prior to 1990, actually. In winter season, you can count them on your fingers in the Pacific as a whole. And it's worth bearing that in mind. And I think we are kind of duty bound to make sure that problem doesn't persist moving into the future. So monitoring is not always the most exciting word when it comes to proposals, but my God, it's important. And I think time series, repeat observations are really important. So we have those temporal records in the future.
Thanks very much. I don't know if Ryan or Natasha, you have anything you'd like to add? I can say that instrumented seals is perhaps one of the greatest advertisements for becoming a polar researcher that I've heard so far. And also
I would
just
just like to say that I started doing oceanography looking at turbulence, where we deployed turbulence probes off the back of ships. And that would involve 24 to 48 hour surveys non-stop with teams of people. You had to look at a wire on the surface to make sure that that wire didn't get caught inside the prop and destroy the ship while you're in the middle of the ocean. David was with me on one of those cruises that we went on and got some of the first turbulence data measurements from an underwater glider on that cruise and backed that up with the old school measurements. And that was back in 2012. So it's not really that long that these underwater ocean gliders have been deployed. And since then, that mission was 10 days. And since then, we've just deployed a mission which was 9 months. So we've increased the length of the gliders, added batteries, we've changed the way that they fly, we've changed the instruments that are on it, and it's becoming a normal. We put a glider in the water, but it was only 2012 that turbulence gliders were new, and only another 10 years before that the gliders themselves were first used. So this is all really quite novel stuff, and I think it's important to emphasize that, and that this data set that you're seeing, although it's like, oh, we've got temperature and salinity in the surface, and oh, look, it's a bit energetic in the winter, and who knew they would have it in a storm? But this stuff is what we need, as David says, along with the ability for us to be able to map these things over time. And it's important to say how novel and new they are, and how exciting it is to have a full year's amount of data and underwater data during the winter season, which before these instruments were available and before this step change in our technological capabilities, we weren't able to do. And that's no small thing.
And perhaps I might add, I mean, the program I went to see with Natasha for was called Osmosis, which was doing something not entirely dissimilar in the North Atlantic, in a rather calm region of the eastern North Atlantic. And actually, the mainstay of the observing program at that point was a mooring array that was rather more expensive, and the gliders were added, and the gliders delivered such high quality data that, you know, there was no question that was the way forward for SO-CHIC. So, you know, it does again emphasize, I think, how these new observations have really changed how we're doing things.
I want to loop Ryan in on that. Go on, Ryan.
Yeah. Well,
model results.
I was actually going to say, going forward, was just to echo what's already been said about the under ice capability, because we're starting to see all of these nice results from the models of high resolution data, both under ice and not under ice, and the added value that would come from observations in the same areas would just really, I think, drive forward a lot of great results. I mean, we'd have great results from the model alone, but you get a lot more if you have both. So I'd say just that innovation of being able to send autonomous vehicles under ice is going to bring a lot.
Yeah, thanks very much. We're coming up on 75 minutes, which I think was the scheduled time for the webinar. So I'll start wrapping things up, but if anyone has any last minute questions that they want to ask, the Q&A has one.
Yeah.
Here, let's go to Andrew Stiles. So he says, related to the previous question, would you prioritize abundance of observations in the Southern Ocean or fewer observations in some of the more hostile and less frequently observed environments? It's a good question. Thank you.
Well, I don't think. I think an abundance of. I don't think we're going to get to the stage where we have an abundance of. Sorry, you can see me on this. I don't think we're going to get to the stage.
It won't be recorded.
I don't think we're going to get to the stage where we have an abundance of gliders in the Southern abundance of measurements in the Southern Ocean anyway, particularly in the ice covered ocean. I mean, I think David's point about the deep ocean is really critical actually here. We have a reasonable coverage of most of the open ocean now with Argo, but more than 2,000 meters is still really poor, really, really poor actually. You know, it's moorings, it's ship sections, and it's actually in some senses getting worse because there's fewer research days on ships to actually get deep ocean measurements than there were 10 years ago. So global measurements are important. I would always you know, advocate for Southern Ocean measurements because that's what I do. But you know, I'm sure everyone's going to have their pet region, and I'm not going to dissuade them of that notion necessarily because you know the whole, as you saw in that graphic, the whole globe is connected through that circulation. But there is a particular problem in ice covered regions, and that is particularly bad in the Southern Ocean. So that's where I would put the resource. But that's me.
Could I jump in?
Yeah.
I'd like to add, I'm sure it's apparent at other places as well, but at British Antarctic Survey, we have, yeah, sorry, David's laughing at the two heads. At British Antarctic Survey, we have an AI team, and they have been using AI to map, first of all, where regions might need more information, how we can deploy our gliders. If we've got a fleet of gliders, maybe we can get one glider to move along to another to save resources and to get them to fly between places. And that whole AI machine learning side of things is really going to expand the autonomous systems. And so the two of them could possibly, I mean, who knows if we've come this far in the last 10, 20 years, and in the next 10, 20 years, we could have these little dudes flying around the ocean all over, and AI telling them where they need to be in order to get the data that we need. So I can see that in our future. And I think that maybe we won't need to make those predictions in quite the same way. Maybe we'll say, oh, well, we do want to focus here. And then AI will say, oh, well, okay, if you want to do that, then we should have 3 or 4 gliders or 1 glider, or using obviously Ryan's modeling and letting us know how the best sampling patterns are. And it all integrates. The observations, the models are no good without the observations to be able to check the models, but the models give us all of that, fill in all of those gaps that we can't do with observations. It's just not possible. And I think I like the fact that AI is going to be coming in and helping with that aspect of it.
I was going to say something related, actually. I mean, I think we need to distinguish between monitoring, observing the global system, and process studies, and very much, I think SO-CHIC has largely been targeted on processes in a particular region. So, but in the atmosphere, I mean, for many decades now, really, we don't take observations to estimate atmospheric energy transports. We have a global observing system combined with the forecasting system to produce the best analysis or reanalysis. And this has been talked about for a while in the ocean, and I don't think we're there yet, but at some point in the future, probably nearer, I would guess, than some people suspect, I think we will move to the kind of system that Tasha was alluding to, where you are routinely combining the models and the observations, and then you can use the observations in a more targeted way to try and minimize the uncertainty overall. But I want to stress, because I know certain observationists will scream at me, and quite rightly, that is not a substitution for going out then and taking these really important process observations too.
Good. I'll refrain from asking any remote sensing questions, both in the interest of time and
it's important too.
It's all important. So let me conclude here. You guys are doing some very important work in a very challenging region. So thank you all for your presentations, and to the audience for their attendance. I'd like to also thank Eva Horochakova for her work on promoting the event and providing technical support. And she worked also previously with Natasha, so thank you for all of the support in this. I'll say again that a recording of the event will be available on the SO-CHIC YouTube channel, which there's a link to in chat. This is the final work package webinar for the SO-CHIC webinar series. There will be an additional webinar, I believe we're scheduled for March, which will wrap up the work of the project in general. I also would like to plug an upcoming policy briefing being conducted between the Ocean Ice and Arctic Passion project. So there you'll see some more Antarctic science on display, and we'll talk a bit more about the under ice shelf sensing and data collection, which ties into this pretty neatly. So that will be held on January 24th, and you can join that online. So with that, I'll close out the webinar. Thanks everyone once again, and best of luck for your future work. Bye all.